This is Ron Sipsick, and this is the third part in a three-part series on consumer choice. We begin the analysis by looking at a table of data that we looked at in the first part of our problem. And here we're talking about a hypothetical buyer who is considering the purchases of coffee and rolls at breakfast. And the table before us has the marginal utility numbers for coffee and rolls outlined. What we see here is that as the buyer drinks the first cup of coffee, the buyer would receive 860 utils of satisfaction. If the buyer were to drink the first cup or eat the first roll, the buyer would enjoy 500 utils of satisfaction. We also notice in the table that as the buyer buys more units of each product, the marginal utility diminishes. In the case of coffee, 860, 800, 720, and so on. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is the idea that as a person consumes more of a particular product, they receive less and less satisfaction from each subsequent unit. When we did the problem in part one, we assumed that the price of coffee was $2 and the price of rolls it was $1, and that the buyer had $10 of income to spend on coffee and rolls. And if you recall, when the buyer spent that money, the money was first spent on rolls, then it was spent on rolls, then some money was spent on coffee, then the buyer came back and bought another roll, then the buyer came back and bought another coffee, and then the buyer was indifferent and bought both of these and stopped at this point because the buyer was out of income. And if you need a review of this process, you can go back to the part one video and take a look at that. But we assume that at a price of $2 for coffee, that the buyer would buy 3 coffee and 4 rolls. Now what we want to do in this segment is we want to change the price of coffee and look to see how this changes the buyer's behavior. And in the end, what we hope to do and will do is derive what is called a demand curve for this particular buyer. So let's assume that the price the buyer pays for coffee is now $1, not $2. Now this makes the problem considerably easier because remember the price of rolls is $1, and if the price of coffee is $1, then there needs to be no adjustment to these MUs. So in other words, this is $8.60 per dollar, this is $800 per dollar, $720 per dollar, and so on. So these are in per dollar, and these were already in per dollar. So we don't need to make any adjustment to the MUs to compare the products. We can simply make the comparisons on the basis of these given MUs. So, where would the buyer want to put the first dollar? Well, $8.60 is clearly better than $500. So the buyer would buy the first coffee. The buyer would buy the second coffee as well because $800 is better than $500. The third coffee, because the third coffee is better than, at $720, is better than $500. The fourth coffee, because the fourth coffee provides more utility than the first roll. And then when we get to the fifth coffee, we see that the buyer would be indifferent. $500 for the fifth coffee, $500 for the first roll. Let's just say that the buyer flips a coin and it comes up rolls, buys the roll. Then it's going to be $500 versus $480. Notice we're on the $6 of expenditure. The buyer can either buy the fifth coffee for 500 utils or buy the second roll for 480 utils. The buyer is going to take the fifth coffee. Then the buyer has a choice between the sixth coffee, 360 utils, or the second roll, 480 utils. We'll take the second roll, we'll take the third roll, and then we'll again be indifferent. And let's say flips a coin, takes the coffee, then comes back and takes the roll, and at this point the buyer is done. You say, why is the buyer done? Because the buyer has spent $10. Spending $1 a piece on coffee, 6 coffee, is $6. Spending $1 a piece on rolls, 4 rolls, is $4. So the $10 budget, remember the budget Y is 10, has been expended. And so the buyer is done. So what we see is if we lower the price of coffee from $2 to $1, the buyer buys more coffee. And so let's summarize this result. If the price of coffee is $1, in other words, it's been lowered from $2 to $1, the buyer now wants to buy 6 coffee, still buys 4 rolls. So what happened here? The number of coffees consumed actually increases. And what happens to the total utility here? Well, if we sum up the MUs of the first 6 coffees and we sum up the MUs of the first 4 rolls, we're going to get total utility. I believe that comes out to, let me do a quick addition in my head, I believe that comes out to 5620. So what we see is there's been an increase in total utility of 1480, if my math is correct. So by lowering the price of the product and the buyer buying more of the product, the buyer enjoys greater satisfaction from a fixed budget. Let me say that again because that's a very important principle. Everything in this problem was held constant except we lowered the price of coffee from $2 to $1. So we held the budget constant, we held the price of rolls constant, we held the marginal utility numbers, or the person's taste and preference for coffee and rolls, constant. So the price of coffee drops from 2 to 1, and what happens? The buyer wants to now buy 6 coffees instead of 3 coffees, and the buyer's total utility, total satisfaction from that fixed budget increases by 1480. And this makes total sense. Buyers are happier in a world of scarcity with a fixed budget when the price of something significant in their budget decreases because they're able to buy more with a fixed budget. Okay, let's scroll down a little bit, and what I'd like to now do is derive something called a demand curve. So I'm going to set up a 2-dimensional space. And we'll label this the price of coffee here. The vertical axis will be the price of coffee. The horizontal axis will be the quantity demanded of coffee. So Q sub D is called the quantity demanded. Notice we're not comparing the quantity of rolls to the quantity of coffee any longer. That is a budget line. We showed you the budget line in segment 1. A budget line shows the quantity of one product against the quantity of another product. In other words, a budget line gives us all the combinations of 2 products that can be purchased with a fixed income and fixed prices. However, in this case, we're not looking at a budget line. We're looking at a demand curve. This is the price of coffee, and we're comparing the price of coffee to the quantity demanded of coffee, and we're holding the price of rolls, income, and marginal utility data all constant. Now what we're going to see, if we do this correctly, is that this relationship is downward sloping. In other words, at a price, let me use a different color here. I'll use green to be consistent with my labeling up above. At a price of $2 for coffee, this buyer chose to buy 3 coffee. Let me change my color. At a price of $1 for coffee, this buyer chose to buy 6 coffee. So as the price of coffee decreased from 2 to 1, the quantity demanded of coffee increased from 3 to 6. So we moved along a demand curve. This is what a demand curve shows. A demand curve shows the relationship between the price of a product and the quantity demanded of that product. I'll put a 0.2 here. So we move down along this given demand curve. And if we had other price points, we could actually sketch out this demand curve with a great deal more accuracy. I have drawn this demand curve as a linear demand curve. Well, it's not really linear because I couldn't keep my hand steady, but it's meant to be a straight line. However, if we actually plotted 4 or 5 points, we'd find that this is actually a nonlinear demand curve. Now notice when we draw a demand curve, we're making some assumptions. We're assuming that income is being held constant, in this case at $10. We're assuming that the price of rolls is being held constant, so the price of other products are being held constant. We're also assuming that MUs are being held constant. So we're assuming that the buyer's taste has not changed for coffee and rolls. We're assuming that the price of rolls, an alternative product, have not changed. And we're also assuming that the buyer's income has not changed. So the demand curve for coffee simply shows the relationship between the price of coffee and the quantity demanded of coffee. And this is what we call the independent variable. It's the cause. Price is the cause. So the change in price caused the change in the quantity demanded. And this variable down there, this is an if-then statement. This is the then part of the statement. So it's if the price of coffee drops from 2 to 1, then the quantity demanded of coffee increases from 3 to 6. The then part of the statement indicates that we're talking about the effect in this relationship. So we could write it out with symbols this way. An increase in the price of coffee leads to a decrease in the quantity demanded of coffee. A decrease in the price of coffee, which is what we did here, leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of coffee. And this relationship has a name. It's called the law of demand. And again, we assume here that income, the price of rolls, which would be the price of other products, and MUs, which represent the buyer's satisfaction or taste for the product, all of those variables are being held constant. Now there are other variables that could affect the consumption of coffee, but we're going to hold those constant. So we're actually making the assumption here, ceteris paribus. This is a Latin term meaning all other things held constant. Now, let's make a note here. Let me go back up to the demand curve here. This is very important. This demand curve here is the demand curve of an individual buyer. It is from the demand curves of individual buyers that we actually derive what are called market demand curves. So if we were to take this buyer's demand curve and other buyers' demand curves and put them together, and actually what this is called is horizontal summing. I do not have time in this lesson to illustrate this. Notice I'm going to use a capital subscript here. This means we're talking about the market. And then if we were to draw a straight line, or as straight as we can make it, put a capital D here. This is the market demand curve. And how did we get that? That is the sum of the individual demand curves, the sum of the individual D's. This is sum of D's. So we take the individual demand curves, add them together, sum them horizontally, and we get a market demand curve. And again, what does the market demand curve say? It says really the same thing. So if this is P1, at P1, this is QD1. At P2, this is QD2. And what have we illustrated? We've illustrated the law of demand. As the price of coffee decreases, the market demand for coffee increases.